David sat on the cold sidewalk, his back resting against the rough brick wall of an abandoned building. His clothes were torn, his hair messy, and his face covered in dirt. His hands, rough and cracked from the harsh weather, held a small tin cup with just a few coins inside. People walked past him, barely sparing him a glance. Some ignored him completely, while others looked at him with disgust. But David didn't react. His eyes remained calm, almost as if he was waiting for something. Loud laughter echoed through the street as a group of men walked toward him. They were dressed in black jackets, their faces full of arrogance. Tony, their leader, walked ahead, a cruel smirk on his face. He was tall, muscular, and had a scar running down his cheek. His gang followed closely behind, their eyes scanning the street like they owned it. Tony stopped in front of David and crossed his arms. "Look at this pathetic beggar," he sneered, "sitting here like the world owes him something." His voice was loud, and a few people on the street turned to watch. One of the gang members, Jake, tossed a coin into David's cup, but not out of kindness. "Here you go, old man," he said mockingly. "Buy yourself a feast." The group burst into laughter, amused by their own cruelty. David looked up at them, but said nothing. His expression didn't change. He simply picked up the coin, turned it in his fingers, and placed it back in the cup. His silence irritated Tony. He expected the beggar to beg, to thank him, or at least show fear. But there was nothing, just calm, steady eyes. "What's wrong?" Tony taunted. "Cat got your tongue." He leaned in closer, his shadow falling over David. "Or do you think you're too good to talk to us?" David still didn't respond. Annoyed, Jake kicked David's tin cup, sending the few coins scattering across the pavement. "Oops," he said with a fake smile. "Looks like you lost your fortune." The gang laughed again. David sighed and slowly reached down to pick up the coins. His movements were unhurried, almost relaxed. It was as if he had all the time in the world. This only made Tony angrier. He wasn't used to being ignored. "You think you're better than us," Tony growled. "You're nothing. Just a worthless old man wasting space." He grabbed David's collar and pulled him up. "Maybe we should teach you some respect." David's feet barely touched the ground as Tony held him up. But even then, there was no fear in his eyes. His expression remained the same, calm, almost amused. A black car slowed down on the other side of the street. Its windows were tinted, and it looked expensive, out of place in this rough neighborhood. But Tony and his gang were too busy humiliating David to notice. One of the gang members, Leo, cracked his knuckles. "Let's take him to the alley. No one will bother us there." Tony smirked. "Good idea." Without warning, they dragged David away from the sidewalk, pulling him toward a dark alley between two old buildings. The sound of their footsteps echoed off the walls. The few people on the street who had been watching quickly turned away, pretending not to see anything. No one wanted trouble with Tony's gang. David still didn't resist. He walked with them willingly, his hands hanging loosely by his sides. Jake shoved him against the wall. "Not so high and mighty now, are you?" David looked up at the night sky. The stars were faint, hidden behind the city lights. He took a deep breath, then turned his gaze back to Tony. "You don't want to do this," he said quietly. His voice was steady, not pleading, just a simple statement. Tony narrowed his eyes. "And why not?" David's lips curled into a small smile. "Because you don't know who I am." The gang burst into laughter. Tony shook his head. "Oh, this is rich. A homeless man with a big secret. Let me guess. You're a lost prince. A secret agent. Maybe a billionaire in disguise." His voice dripped with sarcasm. David didn't answer. He simply watched them, as if he already knew what was coming next. A loud honk interrupted them. The same black car had now stopped right outside the alley. The door opened, and a man in a suit stepped out. His shoes clicked against the pavement as he walked toward them. His face was serious, his eyes sharp. Tony and his gang finally noticed him. They exchanged glances, confused. Who was this man? And why was he walking toward them with such confidence? The man stopped a few feet away. His gaze landed on David, then shifted to Tony. "Do you have any idea what you're doing?" His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a warning. Tony frowned. "Who the hell are you?" The man smirked. "Someone who knows exactly who he is." His eyes flicked to David. "Unlike you." For the first time that night, Tony felt something unfamiliar. Not anger, not arrogance. It was unease. Jake shifted uncomfortably as the well-dressed man took another step forward. The gangsters weren't used to people interrupting them, especially not with this kind of confidence. Tony, however, wasn't intimidated so easily. He crossed his arms and smirked. "Oh yeah," Tony said, his voice dripping with arrogance. "And who exactly are you?" The man in the suit ignored the question and turned his attention to David. There was a strange familiarity in his gaze, almost like he recognized him. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. David gave a slight nod, brushing some dust off his torn sleeve. "Took you long enough," he muttered. Tony and his gang exchanged glances. What was going on? Why did this well-dressed man care about some dirty beggar? "Hold on," Jake said, stepping closer. "You know this guy." He pointed at David, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. The man in the suit smiled slightly, but there was no warmth in it. "You could say that." Tony scoffed and rolled his eyes. "Oh, so what? You're some kind of hero, coming to save the poor old man." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Let me tell you something, buddy. This isn't your business. We're just having a little fun." The man's smile vanished. His expression became unreadable, his posture stiffening. "You think bullying the helpless man is fun?" Leo, another gang member, stepped in. "Hey, look. The guy's dressed like a banker. Maybe he wants to give the beggar a loan." The gang laughed at the joke, but the man in the suit didn't react. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "I'll make this simple," he said, his tone now cold. "Walk away. Now." Tony's smirk widened. "Or what?" The man raised an eyebrow. "Or you'll regret it." For a brief moment, there was silence. Then Tony let out a loud laugh. "Oh man, this just keeps getting better." He stepped forward, getting right in the man's face. "Let me tell you something," he growled. "This is our street. We do what we want. Nobody tells us what to do. Not you, not the cops, and definitely not some rich pretty boy in a suit." The man sighed, shaking his head slightly. "That's disappointing." Before Tony could respond, the low rumble of engines echoed through the alley. Black cars, several of them. They came to a slow stop near the entrance, blocking the way out. The doors opened, and men in dark suits stepped out. They weren't ordinary bodyguards. Their movements were precise, controlled like trained professionals. Tony's smirk started to fade. His gang, who had been laughing moments ago, was now tense. Jake leaned toward Tony, lowering his voice. Tony, who are these guys?" Tony clenched his jaw, his confidence wavering for the first time. He turned back to the man in the suit, suddenly realizing that he might have made a mistake. The man smiled again, but this time, there was something dangerous about it. "Let me introduce myself," he said, slipping his hands into his pockets. "My name is Michael Carter." The name meant nothing to Tony, but the way his gang reacted told him everything he needed to know. Jake's face went pale. Leo took a step back. Even the bystanders at the edge of the alley looked shocked. Tony frowned. "Am I supposed to know who that is?" Michael let out a small chuckle. "I suppose you wouldn't. You see, unlike you, I don't waste my time making a name on the streets." He gestured toward David. "I work for him." Tony blinked. Him. He turned to look at David again, this time really looking. The calmness in the old man's eyes, the way he hadn't been afraid this entire time. Something wasn't right. David gave a small, knowing smile. Surprised. Tony took a small step back, suddenly unsure of himself. Who was this man? And why did a guy like Michael Carter work for him? The answer was coming. And Tony wasn't going to like it. You said. The alley felt smaller now. The air, once filled with the gang's laughter, had turned cold and heavy. Tony clenched his fists, his mind racing. The name Michael Carter still meant nothing to him, but the way his gang reacted told him it was bad news. Jake had gone completely silent, his usual cocky attitude vanishing. Even Leo, who loved to fight, kept his eyes on the suited men stepping out of the black cars. Something was wrong. Tony turned back to David, his eyes narrowing. "What the hell is this?" he demanded. "Who the hell are you?" David tilted his head slightly, as if considering the question. His lips curled into a faint smile. "I told you, you don't want to do this." Tony felt a flicker of doubt, but he quickly crushed it. He had ruled these streets for years, and no old man in rags was going to change that. He forced a laugh, looking around at his gang. "Oh, I get it now. This is some kind of joke, right?" He turned to Michael. "You're trying to scare us with fancy cars and expensive suits." Michael sighed, taking another step forward. "Tony, let me give you a piece of advice. When you find yourself in a situation you don't understand, walk away." His voice was calm, but there was steel behind it. Tony's jaw tightened. He hated being talked down to. "You think you're better than me," he growled. "Just because you wear a suit, because you drive expensive cars." He took a step toward Michael. "You don't know who you're messing with." Michael smiled slightly, but his eyes were cold. "No, Tony, you don't know who he is." He gestured toward David. For the first time since this whole thing started, Tony really looked at the homeless man. Not just his dirty clothes, not just his rough appearance. There was something in his eyes, something steady, something unshakable. David exhaled slowly, as if tired of the game. "I guess it's time," he murmured. Michael nodded. "It is." David turned back to Tony and his gang. His posture shifted, just slightly, but enough. His back straightened. His expression hardened. The lazy, tired man sitting on the sidewalk was gone. "My name is David Sinclair," he said, his voice even. "I own Sinclair Industries." The alley went silent. Jake sucked in a sharp breath. Sinclair Industries. The name was legendary, one of the biggest investment companies in the world. Power, money, influence. The kind of name that even politicians respected. Tony's smirk faded completely. David watched their reactions with quiet amusement. "I see you've heard of it." Tony opened his mouth, then closed it. His mind raced. No, it wasn't possible. This was a trick. A lie. He looked at the ragged clothes, the dirty hands, the tin cup that had been on the ground just moments ago. "You're lying," Tony said, but his voice wasn't as strong as before. Michael chuckled. "Why would he need to lie to you?" David took a slow step forward. "I came here to see the world for what it really is," he said. "To walk these streets as an invisible man. To see how people treat those they believe are beneath them." His eyes locked onto Tony's. "And now, I've seen enough." Tony felt something tighten in his chest. David glanced at the black cars. "You hurt me today. Humiliated me. And yet, I could buy and sell everything you own without even checking my bank balance." His voice was calm, but the weight behind his words was crushing. Tony felt sweat forming on his neck. He needed to fix this. Fast. "Look, man," Tony said, forcing a nervous chuckle. "This was all a misunderstanding. We didn't know." "That's the problem," David interrupted. "You never know. You never stop to think. You assume. You judge. You step on people you think are weak." Tony swallowed hard. The gang behind him had gone completely silent. Even Jake, usually the loudest, wouldn't meet his eyes. David exhaled, shaking his head. And now, it's time for consequences. Tony's stomach dropped. Michael pulled out his phone. "Shall we begin?" he asked, looking at David. David nodded. "Let's." Tony had no idea what was coming next, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to like it. "You said." Tony's breath felt heavy in his chest. His usual arrogance had vanished, replaced by something he wasn't used to. Fear. He could feel his gang shifting uneasily behind him. The power had completely shifted. Michael tapped a few times on his phone, his expression calm but focused. "I just sent the footage," he said casually. Tony's stomach twisted. "Footage." David tilted his head slightly, watching Tony's face. "You thought no one was watching?" he asked, his voice calm. "That no one saw what you did?" Tony clenched his jaw. "What are you talking about?" Michael smirked. "Every camera in this area is controlled by Sinclair Industries. Street cameras, building security feeds." He put his phone back in his pocket. "We have everything. Every word you said, every action you took. And now, so do the authorities." Tony's heart started pounding. No, 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 no. He had done plenty of bad things in the past, but he had always been careful, always made sure there was no evidence. But this was different. Jake cursed under his breath. "Tony, we need to go," he muttered. David shook his head. "Go where?" He gestured toward the black cars, where the suited men were still standing, watching, waiting. "You think they'll let you?" Tony's hands curled into fists. He had been untouchable for so long, ruling these streets like a king. But now he was trapped. David took another slow step forward, his steady gaze locking onto Tony's. "This isn't just about me," he said. "This is about all the people you've hurt, the ones who didn't have power, the ones you walked all over." Tony swallowed hard. David sighed. "But I believe in fairness," he continued. "So I'll give you a choice." Tony flinched slightly. "Do you? What choice?" David raised a hand, ticking off his fingers. "Option 1. You and your gang are arrested tonight. The police are already on their way." Jake's eyes widened. "What?" he whispered. David continued, ignoring him. "Option 2. You leave this place, right now, and you never return." His voice hardened. "Not to this street, not to this city, nowhere near here, ever again." Tony's mind raced. His gang looked at him, waiting for an answer, but he had nothing. No power, no leverage, no way out. He knew what would happen if he got arrested. He had made too many enemies, people who would love to see him behind bars. But leaving, giving up everything, that was just as painful. But looking at David, at Michael, at the black cars filled with men who could make him disappear in a second, Tony realized he had no choice. He gritted his teeth. His pride screamed at him to fight back, to do something. But the fear was louder. Finally, he took a slow step back. "We're leaving," he muttered. His voice was quiet, almost broken. David nodded. "Good choice." Tony turned to his gang. "Let's go." His voice was sharp, but it lacked its usual confidence. Jake hesitated. "Tony." "I said, let's go," Tony snapped. The gang didn't argue. One by one, they turned and started walking. Tony followed, his hands clenched into tight fists. This wasn't just a loss. It was a humiliation. David watched them disappear into the night. He waited until the last shadow faded before finally relaxing his shoulders. Michael chuckled. Well, that was satisfying. David smirked slightly. It was necessary. Michael turned to him, crossing his arms. "So now that your little experiment is over, are you finally ready to go home?" David exhaled. He looked down at his ragged clothes, then back at the city he had walked through for so long. "Yes," he said quietly. "It's time." The gang disappeared into the shadows, their footsteps fading into the night. The once mighty Tony, who had ruled the streets with fear, had left with his head down. The power had shifted, and now the alley felt different, lighter, quieter. David stood still for a moment, watching the empty space where Tony had been. The same place where, just minutes ago, he had been mocked, insulted, and humiliated. He exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of everything settle inside him. Michael watched him carefully. "Are you satisfied?" he asked. David turned to him, a small smile forming on his lips. "It wasn't about satisfaction," he said. "It was about justice." Michael chuckled. Still the same old David. He glanced at the black cars, where his team was waiting. "So, what now? Are you finally ready to leave this life behind?" David looked down at his ragged clothes. His fingers brushed over the worn fabric, the same clothes he had worn every day for the past few months. They were a disguise, but they had also been something more. They had made him invisible, had shown him the true face of the world. He had seen cruelty, greed, the way people looked away from suffering as if it didn't exist. But he had also seen kindness, a stranger offering food, a child smiling at him, a shopkeeper leaving an extra piece of bread on the counter. This city had given him more than he ever expected. But now, it was time to go. David sighed. "Yeah," he said, nodding. "I'm ready." Michael smirked. "Good." He motioned toward the car. "Let's get out of here." David took one last look at the alley, the streets that had been his home, the people who had ignored him, the ones who had helped him. Then, without another word, he turned and walked toward the car. As he stepped inside, the world outside felt distant. The life of a beggar, the struggles, the dirt, the cold nights, it was over. The door shut behind him, and the car pulled away, leaving the dark alley behind. David Sinclair was no longer a nameless man on the streets. He was back. And this time, the world would know exactly who he was. "You said." As the car moved through the city streets, David sat in silence, gazing out of the window. The bright lights and towering buildings passed by like a blur, but his mind was elsewhere. For months, he had walked these streets as a nobody, ignored, ridiculed, and mistreated by those who thought they were better than him. He had seen the true nature of people, both the good and the bad. And now, everything was about to change. Michael sat beside him, studying him with a knowing look. "You're thinking about them, aren't you?" David smirked slightly. "I suppose I am." Michael leaned back in his seat. "So, what's next? Are you going to just forget about everything and go back to your old life?" David turned away from the window and faced him. "Forget," he repeated, shaking his head. "No, I could never forget." Michael nodded, as if he expected that answer. "Then what's the plan?" David exhaled slowly. Tony and his gang were just a small part of a bigger problem. There are many like them, people who abuse their power, who take advantage of those they think are weak. His jaw tightened. "I won't let that continue." Michael smirked. "So the billionaire is turning into a vigilant now." David chuckled. "Not exactly, but I have resources, influence, power, and now I know exactly where to use them." Michael watched him for a moment before nodding. "Then let's get to work." The car pulled into a grand estate, the iron gates opening as they approached. The moment they stopped, a team of assistants and security personnel rushed forward. The door opened, and David stepped out, no longer a beggar but a man with a mission. The world had ignored him when he was nothing. Now, they would never ignore him again. "You said." David stepped into the grand estate, the familiar scent of polished wood and fresh flowers filling the air. The towering walls, crystal chandeliers, and luxurious surroundings were a sharp contrast to the cold streets he had lived on for months. But despite the wealth and power that surrounded him, he felt different. His assistant, Rachel, rushed toward him, her face filled with relief. "Mr. Sinclair, you're back," she said, almost breathless. "The board has been waiting. The media has been asking questions. We thought. She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. We thought something had happened to you. David smiled slightly. Something did. Rachel glanced at his ragged clothes, the dirt still on his hands. She didn't ask questions, but David could see the curiosity in her eyes. Michael walked in behind him, adjusting his suit. Prepare a press release, he instructed. David Sinclair is officially back. Rachel nodded quickly, already taking notes. Of course. She turned to David. Do you want to hold a press conference? David considered it. The world had believed he had disappeared, that he had gone into hiding. Rumors had spread, some saying he had lost everything, others claiming he had fled the country. Now he had a chance to set the record straight. Yes, he said finally. Schedule it for tomorrow. Rachel nodded. I'll arrange it immediately. She turned and hurried off, leaving David standing in the grand hallway of his mansion. Michael crossed his arms. You're really going to tell them what you did? David smirked. Not everything. Just enough. Michael chuckled. You always did like a little mystery. David exhaled, running a hand through his hair. This isn't just about telling my story. It's about making a change. I've seen what happens when people believe they have no one looking out for them. That ends now. Michael raised an eyebrow. So what's the plan? David's expression hardened. I'm going to use my power to fight for those who have none. Michael grinned. Now that sounds interesting. David glanced out the massive windows, looking over the city skyline, the same city where he had been treated like nothing, where people had ignored him, insulted him, and mocked him. He had been invisible before, but now the whole world was going to see him.